Strange Bedfellows, the enduring and very vocal figure in Illinois art. This is an exhibition about people from a place, specifically Illinois, with an emphasis on Chicago. Both place names that have come down to us from their indigenous language. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Illinois, Aurora, Illinois, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux people. May they thrive. I'm here to talk about figure as a narrative device. The exhibition, Figurism, Narrative and Fantastic Figurative Art from the Illinois State Museum Collection. That exhibition, the intent was to bring together artwork that emphasized the pluralistic, eclectic, and highly individualized use of the figure over a roughly 100-year period. I wanted to try also tonight to connect some of the artists in that exhibition to some larger social concerns and artistic movements, discussing how symbolism, American scene, surrealism, magical realism, the grotesque, the existential are present and often intersect in the works exhibited. The Midwest art scene has maintained a strong connection to the figure throughout the 20th century. There's no dominant art movement or style, and what we do see, especially in works before World War II, is a reference back to important moments in 19th and 20th century, early 20th century art history that resides in much of the work that's in the exhibition. And then after the war, artists in Chicago and around the Midwest looked outside of their Western art historical canon towards ancient art, ethnographic art, comics, cartoons, and advertising. Whatever the time period, these art historical and vernacular styles were never sort of slavishly copied, but made personal, introspective, hybrid forms that resonate on a broader art historical spectrum and speak to the contemporary moment. What is constant in all the work is that the body remains credible and identifiable, even when filtered through abstract art's drive towards non-representation. Never portrayed for its own sake, the body tells stories, incites emotions, represents states of the conscious and unconscious being, speaks allegorically, and comments on the condition of contemporary life. And additionally, the work has been selected with an eye towards something fantastic, a heightened sense of the superreal or the supernatural, whether through aggressive, expressive form, high-key color, inventive graphics, or just some ambiguous situations. They push beyond simple answers, as the best art always does, and leaves us with a question or two that sparks us to think about our own lives. So this is a rather tall order to cover all this, which I'll try to do. And the challenge is not trying to define like an exacting chronology, but to identify a milieu, a time and place where artists have composed relational scores that when replayed, still capture a mood or feeling. The place is primarily Chicago and surroundings. The lion's share of art production has been focused around here, but a few notable exceptions are on exhibit. And another challenge is using our collection to tell a story, because not all the canonical artists of that history are represented. But we do have works by contemporaries and compatriots, followers, admirers who often work to tell the story just as well. For example, we do not have a Liam Gollop in our collection, who with Cosmo Campali and Westerman, H.C. Westerman, are the most often cited artists of the late 1940s and 1950s monster roster group. But we do have works by Don Baum, and we have works by Campoli, Fred Berger, Ted Houken, June Leaf, Seymour Rosofsky, and Evelyn Statziner from that same time period, and as well as later works by other artists that extend the subject concerns of the monster roster decades beyond their first appearance. And this is kind of important, that difference between source and derivation, which is sort of considered a bad word in art history, but I kind of think it's really important when you look at a group like the Monster Roster and see how what they were doing at their time period, the late 40s and 50s, resonates with artists 2 decades afterwards. The message is still there. The impulse and the power of the work is still there. And to me, that is much more powerful. And what this wider collecting focus of ours does is allows us to give voice and presence to artists that are not readily associated with the mainstream. The State Museum, we've had an interest in the narrative figure for quite a while. We had the first major retrospective of Gertrude Abercrombie's work, and also the first retrospective of Julia Thecla's work. We have had queer retrospectives of Ted Houken, of Carbondale painter Carolyn Plockman that are in the exhibition, sculptor Brett Kington, Preston Jackson, Michiko Itatani, and Eleanor Spies Ferris. We've had group exhibits called The Environmental Figure, In the Shadows of Ivan Albright, Cross the Divide, Reconsidering the Other, along with smaller exhibitions of figurative artists like Katie Kahn, who teaches out at DeKalb, Riva Lehrer, Ellen Roth Deutsch, and Sue Ellen Roca. So for us, having this collection is a way of kind of immersing ourselves into this larger history of the figure, the narrative figure in Illinois. So let's start with this. This is Frances Badger's assignment. It was a family tree that she did for Kathleen Blackshear's class in like 1948 or 1949, where she places her contemporaries into categories of art history like a family tree. I totally geek out on this. This is like one of those wonderful little fun things to look at and see what names still are important and who's disappeared, and just how they categorize things. So Badger was already a well-established artist and painter and muralist for decades before she went back to school, so she knew many of these artists personally. These were her contemporaries. What I think is important when I was looking at this list is that there are 25 men and 16 women. A little over 1/3 are women artists represented, which is better than most listings from that day in terms of gender parity, which is another strength of Chicago in the Midwest, the strong representation of women artists. Badger does visualize, what many contemporary art historians say about the early history of Chicago art. Although I think I would question the importance of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism these days, and give more emphasis to Expressionist tendencies. And what is also interesting is she has this weird little side branch of surrealism coming off of like Post-Impressionism or something. At that point in like 1948, surrealism was kind of a new word in the vocabulary. And I don't think she quite knew what to do with it. Now, if I were to do this tree, I would probably make surrealism coming off of a symbolist, fantastic trunk, and then that branch now would probably cover most of the canopy of the tree 50 years later. So when we're looking at our state, you know, the art history of a place like Illinois, there's a couple factors, like what were the schools? What were the local and regional professional exhibitions? And what were the influences from outside teachers, and what were the influences from migrants, people who came here from somewhere else, and what did they bring with them? So the School of the Art Institute, which was originally started as an art academy in 1866, is really important in this art history, as many of us in this room have probably gone there at some point or another. Though it was conservative by nature when it started, it did include women in the curriculum, which was really important. Many of whom, the men and women who graduated, would then, as part of the sort of education, would go on to study in like Europe, would go to Paris or Munich afterwards for their sort of postgraduate grand tour, artistic grand tour. And the figure was the primary teaching tool at the Art Institute and stayed sort of the primary educational focus through much of the early 20th century. It was not a progressive hotbed. Catherine Koo, who was a curator during the mid part of the century, wrote, compared to the late 19th and early 20th century artists of the Eastern Seaboard, those trained at the Art Institute may seem more conservative, less experimental, more deliberately moored in accepted practices. This is sort of looking back at the sort of first 50, 60 years of the school. Yet at the same time, Chicago was burgeoning lustily. It's a great word. Its freewheeling profile, aggressive and raw. So it was academic. It was tied to the subject of history, portraiture, classical sculpture. They did work from model, but they also worked from plaster cast, and genre scenes. If you really want to know what that institution may have looked like, If you go to the Vanderpool Art Museum at the Ridge Park Field House in the Beverly neighborhood, that's the old Art Institute galleries. This is the Vanderpool. It's a really great trip to go down there because it's like a trip back in time. Vanderpool was a teacher there, and many of his students, after his death, assembled this collection. And it is, like I said, this wonderful slice of history. Yet for its conservative outlook, the Art Institute faculty, the trustees, the president thought it was important for people to see contemporary modern art, even though the Art Institute at that point in the early 1900s did not collect any. And one of the things they did is they brought the Armory, the famous Arbor Day Show, the International Exhibition of Modern Art that was organized by some East Coast ne'er-do-well modernist. That was an important gathering, one of the first important gatherings of modern work from Europe and from the United States. And it did not go over well here. It was pretty much roundly criticized. And art historians really don't think there was much of an influence on the artist in Chicago, but it was probably their first exposure to Cubism and Impressionism and Symbolism and Ashcan and other important, what we consider to be sort of important moments in late 19th, early 20th century art history. But what was important is the school, the Art Institute had an annual exhibition, the Chicago Vicinity Show, which was organized in 1897 and ran for almost 100 years, till about the mid-80s. An annual exhibition. And this was a place where many artists from the region had the opportunity to show and to be seen by their peers. It was a bit of a sort of a lens through which you could examine what was going on. And again, the first exhibit held in 1897 had 53 women and 53 men and 36 women. Pretty decent odds there, which I think again sort of showed that emphasis of that Chicago made space for women. When you compare that to the Arbor Show, which had 400 plus pieces, 5% were women in that exhibition. So Chicago was kind of radical. There are great art histories to read, so I'm not going to go much more into this history, but I wanted to touch on some of the pieces that are in the exhibition. But I also want to just point out the fact that this idea of migration, who came here? So that first sort of paragraph after Samuel Greenberg, actually Boris Tropchevsky, those are artists that are in that timeline or that tree that Francis Badger put together. Almost half of the artists were not native born or did not study here. And you can see where they're coming from. They're coming from New York, or Denmark, Poland, Czechoslovakia. These artists are coming here in their early 20s, so they probably had some education in Europe. They may have had some education or exposure to art in Europe or New York before they came here. They're bringing ideas. Think of yourself when you're 20, 21, and you're coming to art school or going to any college. You're sucking this stuff in, just sucking it up, whatever you're seeing, like a sponge. And I think that's really kind of important in looking at the fact that the Art Institute may not have been teaching modern art, but it was in the water, as it were. So one of the first artists, and it's the first sculpture you see when you come in there, that bronze woman, Alfonso Iannelli. He came to Chicago from Los Angeles in 1914 to work for Frank Lloyd Wright on his project, the Midway Gardens. And he's probably most well known for his Sprite, which Frank Lloyd Wright had commissioned him to do this architectural program for the Midway Gardens, which is now gone, which was basically a sort of garden, like a beer garden, drinking, dancing place. But he was working with Frank Lloyd Wright's very geometric, horizontal line, including much of Frank Lloyd Wright's decorative motifs within his figure, but that was his invention. Later, and there was a big to-do about that, because Frank didn't really give him much credit for what he did. But his later work takes on a much more streamlined deco kind of feel to it. And Iannelli and his wife Margaret set up a studio in Park Ridge where they worked as artists, but also as product designers for many, many decades afterwards. And you can actually go to his studio. But for us, we're going to look at this piece, which is called Spring. This was made, the original plaster was made in 1908. He made it when he was a student in New York, working under the sculptor Gutzon Borglum, who did Mount Rushmore, and also Stone Mountain, which is another nasty little history. But it's really part of this 19th century symbolist feel to this figure. Spring gives us a figure of a young woman, bringing to mind the style, the character of the symbolist and Art Nouveau movements of the 19th century, where the women figures often carry symbolic and mythical references. Spring is a kind of water nymph, bound to nature through rock and water and hiding her face from us, a mystery to be revealed. But she is wraith-like, reminiscent of earlier symbolist artists such as Ferdinand Hodler, this piece, The Day, Truth from 1900, or even George Manet, the sculptor who sculpted man's inner spiritual conflicts, such as kneeling youth on the left. These sort of angular, gaunt figures that, to me, seem both underaged and malnourished. And even though they seem a bit coy, would probably kill you in a second, which is probably what the symbolists were really after. That's a Hover there on the right as well, too. And another early artist from Chicago is Manuel Dawson, who is a really wonderful oddball case. He's probably Chicago's truly first modernist. He was trained as an architectural engineer at the Arbor Institute, which later became IIT, which became many, many other things, the Bauhaus and IIT. But while he was training at the Arbor Institute, he also started to paint and draw. Really without any formal art training, just the technical training. But he ended up creating this wholly distinctive body of abstract work, parallel to his sort of New York and European companions. This was in the early 1900s, before 1910. But he wasn't working in a vacuum, because we do know that he was well connected within what was a burgeoning sort of modernist community within Chicago. He was reading the work of Arthur Wesley Dow, one of his prints, who was very influenced by Japanese aesthetics. Dawson was also looking at Japanese prints himself. He was reading Whistler, looking at Whistler, and he was also knew Arthur B. Davies, who spent a few years in Chicago in the early 1900s, and painted these wonderful, like, dreamy landscapes with attenuated figures, like this piece, which is called Maya, Mirror of Illusion, from 1910 at the Art Institute. So Dawson's early figures were like these drawings here, kind of loopy, goofy, loose, wonderful pieces. They were these landscapes inhabited by naive figures, very flat, very simplified. And perhaps he was experimenting with color and form, sort of in as a break from the technical drawing of his education. He referred to them as fantasies or play paintings. But the piece that's in the exhibition is this Adam and Eve, and this is from 1908. And this is a pretty forward-looking painting for Chicago at the time, I think. He gives us this figure of presumably Adam and Eve, that's what he called it, in this simple abstracted composition with these really strange coloration. And he places one of the most important mythic scenes in a landscape of otherworldly tone and effect. To me, it feels symbolist. It just feels like something drawn from both the psyche and from the dream world. And it may have come from his readings and his connections, his social connections, and his artistic inquiry. In his journal that he wrote that art for him was an attempt to fix forms in painting or sculpture that have given an emotion. So he's starting from an emotional point of view. But for here, we have paradise, where Adam and Eve live in a place known to no man at all. And another symbolist transport, there's a detail of them. And another sort of symbolist transport to Chicago is the mysterious Indiana Giberson, which is a great name. Her name was Anna Giberson, but she took her mother's name, Indiana, and she spelled her name various ways. She had a lot of critical attention in Chicago in the 1920s. She came here from New York in 1918, after having spent some time in Paris, after having spent some time in New York. In fact, she lived in the Sherwood Studios in the Upper East Side. Her name is the second to the bottom, Anna Giberson. Her neighbor was Robert Penrod. And unfortunately, this got cut off because when you look at it, the column over here, application, artist. She was in this like kind of radical New York moment, you know, it's kind of wonderful. And then she disappears from the record. After about 1924, there's not much written about her, and then somebody reported her death in 1944. That's all that's really known about her. But we do have this chatty little piece of information from Art News in 1924. And this was that article that was on the left-hand side. You'll see here. Let's go back to the left-hand side. While painting a picture for the Paris Salon, and this is the article. Painting a picture for the Paris Salon in 1912, she struck her elbow on the edge of her easel. A paint-filled brush flew up and hit her in one eye, the result of which was that she was entirely blinded in both. She lived for 2 years in a darkened room in a Paris hospital. She later regained a little of her sight. Her studio in Chicago is now a dark room where she sits and dreams until she's ready to paint. When she switches on a powerful arc light, which is trained on a model and canvas, she paints swiftly until the pain in her eyeballs warns her that it's time to cease. So let your eyeballs tell you when it's time to stop working. So from the beginning, Guyverson specialized in paintings of solitary, sort of semi-nude women posed in a studio with exotic oriental objects and costumes, with titles like, on the left, Enchanted Beauty, or Hula Girl on the right. And by the late 20s, she was all, I already said that part, by the late 20s, she almost all disappeared. But in our collection, we have this painting, Dove, from 1920, which is in the case, I believe, which to me feels akin to Ian Ellie's Spring, that sculpture, because for me, they both are these kind of mythical, waif-like, waifish creatures that are peering out of us from some depth of time or space. Not quite human, not quite otherworldly. And Guyverson's women, they're always women, are exotic. And to me, they are the update of the 19th century fascination with the femme fatale, sort of seductive, mysterious, and comfortable in her own sexuality and sensuality. Guyverson's model blinks at us here, you know, from the canvas, as if she were pulled out of the watery depths. But in fact, she was probably blinking at us because she had this powerful arc light just pounding in her eyes. And she's probably ready to water up and cry at any second. Another woman who's partially forgotten in time, unfortunately, is Fritzi Broad. And here's Red-Haired Woman from 1933, which came to us from the Gertrude Abercrombie estate. Fritzi, like Guyverson, focused on women as a subject, but now with a sensibility that I think is more German, you know, more expressive than Ian Ellie and Guyverson's central forms, symbolist forms. And Fritzi was born in Prague, Czechoslovakia. She studied there, and she also studied in Vienna in the early part of the 19th century. So she probably would have been familiar with German Expressionist and Austrian Expressionist. When she came to Chicago in 1924, she came to go to the School Art Institute. And she had a career as a very important, very talented textile designer. And she also used these sort of textile patterns in many of her work, like this wonderful expressive portrait here. And she also, in this one as well too, where she's using this kind of motif, this decorative motif of Eastern European folk garments in her women. And then she also used those in these very highly successful books that she published on design in the 40s and 50s, which were based on Eastern European models. But in the mid-30s, she started creating works on paper and prints and also brightly colored paintings. And the works on paper like this one have a very earthy feel. They usually are images, very nostalgic images that have an Eastern European reference, usually women at work, oftentimes wearing very traditional or patterned clothing. Her paintings are a little bolder, a little bit stronger, and again seem to have a debt perhaps to somebody like Paula Modersohn-Becker or some of the other German or Viennese Austrian expressionists. And in her own work, in the Red-Headed Woman, she has this kind of flashing aura and this sort of sensuality to her. Yet she's somewhat wistful in her expression, She's almost sort of Marlene Dietrich, like I'm tired. But very sensual. Look at that eyeshadow. I mean, this is 1924. This thing just glitters. It's really quite astounding. Here's Paula. So back to our artist tree. So Francis Badger has broad, fritzy broad, leafing off of a rather thick branch of the fauve branch of the tree. And a lot of people, especially art historians, have made the point that Chicagoans weren't so enamored of French painting. They didn't really care for Matisse or really the French fauves. They never quite kind of sunk into the consciousness the way some of the German artists had. So with Fritzi, I think she could go either way, but I would move her branch up into the Expressionist branch, just so you know. Which leads me to another woman. And also, if we notice is that this relationship to the nude, you know, we are so conditioned now in a way to, we reconsider the male gaze and how male artists have looked at the female model. Certainly plenty of examples of it. Women were doing it too. They were outstanding women artists like Broad, like Messina Barton, like Indiana Giberson, working with the nude without perhaps some of the prurient interest and ideological craptrap that goes along with some of the male artists. Chicago women have made some great flesh, sparkle, and shine. And no better than our own Messina Barton here. She was an original. She was outspoken. She was confident. She was an ardent feminist. And when she came to Chicago from Michigan in 1921, at the age of 20, she started taking figure drawing classes at the Art Institute and was instantly or immediately recognized by her teacher, Leanne Kroll, an Ashcan school artist, as for her talent. And she continued this throughout her career for like 80 years of painting the figure, painting portraits. There she is. There's Fritzi with two of her portraits in the Smithsonian Institute's archives. So they were also fearless in scale. As you know, the Giberson and the Broad are rather small, intimate pieces. And at this point, Broad was, Messina Barton was like, I'm giving you the full treatment. This painting, which is in the exhibition, entitled Self-Portrait with Jade Necklace from 1932, is part of a pair. And there they are. She painted this in 1932, but prior to that, she had an interest in the nude, which came on because of a critic. C.J. Bulliet, who was a prominent art critic in Chicago, who wrote about the nude, particularly the subject of Salome. He wrote a book about Salome. In 1925, and also in 1930 he wrote, women, quote, have done nothing first-rate in the area of the nude, and congenitally never can accomplish such. So, Messina Barton rose to the challenge, and she painted this piece and her double self-portrait along with other nudes. So in some ways she was like, I'm going to show you what women can paint the nude. And her John the Baptist is really a far cry from the traditional kind of like fixated, princess who's whatever, dancing for her father and in love with this, prophet. This woman is business. She's really more like a Judith than a Salome. And she's out to do the deed. And I sometimes think the head is really like the head of a critic. Now, Bulliet, the critic, would become a staunch champion of Messina's work. And even though he was married, would be her lover for 10 years. And he describes her as a defiant individualist, quote, blunt and outspoken. She tears down the curtains of sham. She's as primitive and barbaric in her emotions as in her colored lusts. The man is clearly in love with her. Bulliet's choice of words, blunt, outspoken, primitive, barbaric, belie his own prejudice on how a woman artist should behave. Barton took her own counsel as an artist. She wrote, art is a personal expression. I paint exactly what I feel, and I am not influenced by the methods of other artists, even those whom I admire most. I paint to please myself. So to address that odd surrealist offshoot in Badger's Tree, Susan Weiniger, art historian in the Chicago Modern Catalog, wrote that surrealism as a term, so we're sort of jumping ahead now, surrealism as a term is used mostly retrospectively, post-1947. Because in 1947, Frederick Sweet and Catherine McCoo at the Art Institute mounted an exhibition of abstract and surrealist American art. And this was the kind of defining moment for bringing sort of surrealism into the vocabulary, which is probably why in 1948, when Badger was putting this tree together, she was probably still wrestling with how to address all of that. So Susan Weiniger, again, sort of retrospectively, is looking at surrealism in terms of this early part into the mid part of the 20th century in Chicago. And she wrote that the term surrealist, and equally elastically, the term magical realist or fantasist, can be applied to artists from 1910 to 1945, whose concerns were not a unity of style or movement, but of subject, of subjectivity, based on the idiosyncrasies of individual personality and vision that forged a vital trend in Chicago. So she's really saying it's not a movement as much as it's a sensibility. And Frederick Sweet wrote that surrealism in America is informed by a strong romantic streak. Quote, the imaginative qualities of many of our artists have been easily developed into the fantastic and dreamlike imagery which we may call surrealism. So in Chicago, surrealism was never slavishly copied from its New York or European antecedents. So this is a Jackson Pollock that was in that 1947 exhibition, which, you know, this abstract expressionism as an offshoot of surrealism pretty much took over and dominated much of the Eastern Seaboard in the later part of the later 40s and 50s. Nor was it made manifest through manifestos and declarations like in Europe among the artists. It never had a leader. It was informed by symbolist ideas. It was also informed by artists looking at even earlier sort of fantastic artists from like the Renaissance, people like Bruegel or Bosch. So it's really this lens of individual vision, the drive towards expression that eclipsed any formal or sort of automatism developing in the East Coast surrealist circles. This is John Wilde from Milwaukee, who was part of a circle of friends with Gertrude Abercrombie and other Chicago artists. And this this lens of this individual vision, this subjectivity, you know, really ranging from the early 20th century on up, has kind of kept that pulse strong and healthy to the present day. So, we're looking at this idea of what we call maybe Chicago surrealism, fantastic work, and we could talk about two artists, Gertrude Abercrombie and Julia Tekla. They reside sort of firmly in this camp, and they both have two small pieces in the exhibition. So Abercrombie was a Chicago painter, maybe known to some of you, who developed her own unique style and color palette, creates surreal, dreamlike imagery. Her mature work from the 40s to the 60s is haunted by a female figure, tall, sharp-eyed, gaunt, who wanders through interiors and landscapes, a stand-in for the artist herself. She says, I always paint myself. So this painting, Between Two Camps, is a surrealist moment really launched in her own life. It was about her divorce and her remarriage. So the two camps are her ex-husband on the left in the red tent, and her current or upcoming husband in the black tent, moored to the stairs of her home in Hyde Park. And there she stands waving her pink flag. Is it a flag of truce? We're not really sure. Is it a flag of celebration, or is it a flag of surrender? We're not quite sure, because as Susan Weiniger says, the stairs, however solid, lead nowhere. Neither down the same way she came up, or off the deep end into oblivion. And likewise, the tents represent temporary shelter, or in Weiniger's appraisal, quote, a psychic space where refuge is tenuous and undependable. So, this is kind of what's going on with this piece. And what is notable about Abercrombie's work is that she returns again and again to this airless, stark, nocturnal world which is emotionally charged, but for some people refer to it as stifling or lifeless and dead. And for others, like me, it's a dream place, a place of comfort through familiarity, a known world of sort of like limitless horizon and really no surprise. Eleanor Spies Ferris, a contemporary artist, does the same thing. She paints in a sort of liminal space, vast and unknowable, but sort of enveloping and intimate in its darkness. So it's kind of a great space of ambiguity and a little bit of anxiety. It's a great place to be. Now, Julia Tekla, who is the sort of opposite of Abercrombie, moved to Chicago in 1920 at the age of 21. So this is really great. 1920, Giverson came here at 1918, she was 37, but Tekla, Broad, and Barton, all three came between 1920 and 21, and they were like 20, 21 years old. What a great kind of meeting of these people at one time coming together at this place. And they came to take classes at the School Art Institute. So Tekla dropped her name of Connell, her surname, and took the name Tekla, which is the name of an aunt or a cousin who was a nun, Sister Tekla. And she fashioned this new identity for herself, this identity that was distinctive address and her personal vocabulary, of sort of fairy tale image of herself and of her artwork, which is full of like wee little animals and figures. Tekla's early work are representational, but as personal and unconventional as she was. She lived in a tiny apartment in the Tree Studios with an assortment of animals, including like a chicken and a rabbit. The chicken was dyed pink, I believe. Again, the Chicago critic C.J. Bulliet described her as shy, self-effacing, and quiet, and declared her, quote, the mystery girl of Chicago art. So there's this whole persona that's wrapped around her and her work. And some people say, we shouldn't, art historians have argued that her oddness was a performance that should not outshine the credibility of her as an artist herself, which is true, because she developed this really original process of vocabulary that's distinctly her own, this thick wash that she would pour onto to the paper and then scratch and draw into it. They are both evocative, sort of pull you in, but the same way remain completely on the surface. And her images, like this, which is the exhibition, they all tend to be very small. It's called Dreamer and Nudes. It's sort of hard to see, but when you look at the piece, it's just this progression of tiny figures moving off into the distance. Later on, she did a series of smoke drawings, running paper with a candle, and then this is actually a very sort of surrealist, sort of automatic kind of process. Critic Paul Schofield wrote in 1937 in the Midwest Art Scene an article called The Midwest Art Scene Comes of Age. He said, within the last few years, Miss Tekla has appeared, but she has done so explosively, and to the grief of anyone who should try to attempt to classify her. She produces paintings that are strangely charming and in such faultless taste that they approach the magnificent, as a kind of Chicago Odilon Radon. And I paraphrase that article because in between this praise, he talks about the fact that her pieces are really too small to really be serious painting. And I think the Odilon Radon comment was a little bit of a slight, again, because of this, I think he thought them a little too decorative, and may have thought her a little bit too decorative. But I think Tekla has won out over Schofield's criticism. And again, our friend Bulliet, C.J. Bulliet, wrote a year later, 1938, Chicago women painters are, on the whole, superior to Chicago's men, and more inventive, more original. So we've got these three artists, Barton, Tekla, and Abercrombie, who performed in public, which I think is sort of the strategy to succeed at this time period, the 1930s. They created these personas of themselves, as they did in their own work. In many ways, their work and their subject were, who they were and their subject were intimately tied. And I think that strategy was intentional and unique, because it shook them free from the normative constraints of how women were to behave in public, and probably sort of released them or removed them from expectations on the part of their male counterparts and critics. They became characters, goddesses, in their own right, something mystical like their work. So we could talk about a couple guys here. Here also the 1930 Ivan Albright and Carl Heckner, who also carry on the expressive tendencies that we saw in some of the other work, but with a little more gruesome effect. So you saw this print, very small print by Carl Heckner. He came here from Germany in 1910 at the age of 27. He had already studied a little bit in Germany as an artist and worked at Marshall Fields as doing advertising, and also did sort of large-scale painted decorative patterns, like this painting Cleopatra, which is not quite that big, but it's pretty large, very flat, very decorative. The wonderful thing about it is it's a sort of maybe an Art Nouveau-ish sort of decorative motif, a little German, a little stiff, but if you look at the faces, they're just glaring at each other. There's already something royal underneath this guy's like self-conscious. I mean, the whole idea about the crown, the uneasy, the head that wears the crown. Every one of the crowds like either looking at her or looking at each other like, who's next? But with World War I, this really affected Hector in a very powerful way. And he felt that his work changed to sort of reflect his own reaction to the war, and particularly how he looked at the perspective of war and power in relationship to labor and people's lives. And his later work would address these themes as well as themes of spiritual enlightenment. As he wrote, quote, truth, in bitter truth, and the struggle of life in general. So that print, Homecoming, is from 1935, but it was derived from this earlier painting from 1919 that he painted in Chicago. That's called The Homecoming of 1918, which was painted in response to the brutality of World War I and the displacement of millions of people from their lives before the war. It's this onward, this unrelenting, just march of the wounded and dispossessed coming at you. Again, Bolliot wrote that it was one of the most horrendous, most powerful anti-war pieces ever painted at the time. So he decided in 1935, when he was working in the graphics division of the Illinois Art Project for the WPA, to redo it. And he encouraged his students to address the political themes of the time. And in some ways, I think he was, and he did say he was responding to what was going on in Europe at the time. He saw this rise of fascist governments, and he saw this possibly happening all over again, and felt that this image needed to be reproduced and brought back out into the world. Ivan Albright, Chicago native, was one of the most provocative artists of the 20th century. Again, probably a name that you recognize. And he's referred to as a reluctant modernist, because he rather saw himself more squarely in an old master tradition for his technical skill and his virtuosity. But his subject and his ever more fantastic, decadent approach to the figure really places him between magical realism and the grotesque, a sort of grotesque surrealism. Like this painting, one of his earliest paintings from 1929-30, Into This World Came a Soul Called Ida. Albright focused primarily on portraits, painting in a richly detailed, meticulous manner that accentuated every wrinkle and flaw, allegorical work that addressed ravishes of time and overindulgence. His work was deliberately ghoulish, earning him the title, quote, the master of the macabre. And his most celebrated painting, of course, is the portrait of Dorian Gray from 1943-44, painted for the Oscar-winning film, if you watch an Oscar, adaptation of Oscar Wilde's 1891 novel. So this print of ours from 1947 is his own version of Dorian Gray, because it was based on two earlier paintings from 1934 and 1935, because this print is over 10 years later. And the two paintings in 34 and 35 show him sort of well-dressed, sitting at a table, consuming spirits and smoking cigars, and slowly showing the effects of self-indulgence. The print, some 12 years later, shows the same figure, now further aged and decayed. Go back there. Yes. So we're going to move forward a little bit here into after World War II, the post-war monsters and imagists. From the late 1940s through the 70s, artists emerged with some camaraderie of style and subject, one of the first time in Chicago history, and they shared a lot of exhibition histories. Many were friends, and down the decades became teachers and mentors to another group of artists. Some stuck together while others moved on, and some continued just to work on the fringe of any sort of group affiliation, and some faded away. Those who did work throughout their career saw their work change from the initial efforts that brought them attention, and this can always be difficult for artists because you kind of get remembered for what you did, and the newer work can become a stumbling block for recognition as you move your career down the line. So for the imagist and for the monster roster, that becomes both a bit of a burden and also something to celebrate. So in 1972, this is Seymour Rossi painting. In 1972, the critic Franz Schultz wrote a book called Fantastic Images, which was a kind of compendium of Chicago art from 1945 onward. And in that, he has talks about a group of artists called the Monster Roster, which came to prominence in the late 40s and early 1950s. And this included Frank Berger and Ted Houken and Evelyn Statzer, a later piece of hers, who were in the exhibition, and also the aforementioned William Golub, and people like Don Baum in the middle, Cosmo Capaldi, June Leaf, the piece on the right, and Seymour Rossi. So the monster rosters were shared an interest in the figure, predominantly, during a period that was often fixated with abstraction, especially on the East Coast. And they created deeply humanistic psychological works that drew on classical mythology and ancient myth and ethnographic art, which was a big part of the curriculum at the school. Stylistically, they were all over the board because we had Golub and Berger's, kind of charred, scarred flesh, but you also had at this time Evelyn Statzer doing these really kind of primitive, whimsical drawings and photographs. In particular, in this exhibition from this monster roster, we have Ted Houken, this red relief from 1955 to 60, which has that same ancient feel to it. It kind of looks like, I think it looks like a Sheila and the Gig, which are these kind of medieval female figures explaining their vulvas that were carved above churches in Ireland, Scotland, and France, even into Spain. And they have this real powerful symbolic presence to them. Houken was studying and looking at work at the Field Museum. He was also traveling through, as a young man, traveled through France and visited, saw cave paintings and carvings, primitive works from around Europe, and it influenced his work. And his piece, this piece, like the Sheila and the Gigs, gives us this really sort of ambiguous, powerful presence. The same thing we find in this piece called Angel, which is from 1953 by Ted Houken. In this case, he's given us this more folky, sort of very folky-inspired, piece, which is this creature that seems to straddle life and death. It's Angel, but it looks a little gruesome. And in appearance, we have this form, which you see in tombstones and sort of colonial and early colonial tombstones in New England, of the winged skull, this symbol of fleeting mortality, oftentimes sort of grinning. It's a great motif. And in Houken's version, he's transforming this sort of hulking body of this angel into these multiple grinning faces, some hidden, some quite clearly defined. And we wonder, is this like a guardian or a protector? Is this angel a menace or is this a devil? It's something unsettling. It's a vision of grinning death and angelic resurrection in one. And it also has that really kind of like carnival feel to it too, with those clownish red cheeks and grinning face. That's probably the most unsettling part of the whole piece. And even with Berger, with that smaller painting of the collection and this head of his, there's a monumental feel to it. It feels something like maybe from an Olmec sculpture. Something sort of pulled, carved from the earth, showing the marks of time. They're scarred, they're vulnerable, and they're massively imperfect pieces, even though they're on an intimate scale. Schultz's book, Fantastic Images, Goes on then to mention the Harry Who, because at this point they'd already been established, and this is the next group of artists that followed the, and knew many of the monster roster artists. And there's this sort of vague, kind of not really distance between them. And he sort of uses this term Chicago imagist in that book, which is coming into parlance at the time. Chicago imagist or Chicago imagism, and it's a fluid term, which is covering work from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and really kind of includes a monster roster back in the 50s. And it's still present to this very day, because many of these artists are still working and still carrying some aspect of that signature, what we call imagism. So what is this Chicago imagism? There's been a lot of ink spilled about it. These are just examples of books that I have. You can look it up, so I'm not going to try to define it. Okay, good. But let's just first, because there's been quite a really good writing about it. And these are some of the books that are out there, and these are recent. But we'll start with Harry Who. And quite clearly, the Harry Who were a name of 6 artists who came together to exhibit. To join forces and exhibit together in the mid-60s. That was Jim Falconer, Art Green, Gladys Nilsson, Jim Nutt, Sue Ellen Roca, and Carl Morrison. And these 6 artists mounted unconventional exhibitions of vivid and bold graphic work at the Hyde Park Art Center in the Chicago South Side. These are examples of some of their exhibitions. And over the period of 4 years, and they transformed the art landscape of Chicago. Injecting a new and unique voice in the city's rising art world, but also its rising national and international sort of presence. The images found inspiration in so many things outside of the art world. They looked at comic books, they looked at toys, they looked at advertisement, their own families, theater, music, books. A subsequent artist, a group of artists, these are both an early and a little bit later, Gladys Nilsson. Gladys Nilsson is in the exhibition. And after these initial group of Harry Who shows, there was a subsequent group of artists, including Barber Rossi, who's in the exhibition, and Ed Paschke, who came together and mounted more exhibitions at the Hyde Park Art Center with titles such as False Image, Non-Plus-Sum, and the Harry Who, after the Harry Who exhibits. And other contemporary artists such as Phyllis Bramson, and Laurie Gunn, Richard Hull, these are in the exhibit, Robert Lusstetter, that piece isn't, but there's another piece in the exhibit, and Eleanor Spies Ferris also sort of fall under this rubric of this term, Chicago imagism, imagist. And so the name has stuck, and it's sort of become a fairly broad umbrella to describe a couple decades of artists. So it's become a little bit unwieldy in sort of the art history, and so people are trying to sort of parse it out. There was a really great exhibition recently at the Elmhurst Art Museum that Phyllis Bramson put together, this exhibition that was called What Came After, Figurative Painting from 1979 to 1989. And so we talk about post-impressionism, post-imagist as well too with that. So it's a growing, changing, kind of really dynamic art history, and these artists are still making work. And so we'll continue to have a lot of fun with trying to figure it out. But what really holds true with all of this work, I think with the monster roster, with the imagist, with this really bad attempt to try to define what that is it's the body under stress, under pressure. It's the body in extreme, buoyant, visually heightened situations that reflect equal parts emotional punch and a really formal graphic invention and a really formal graphic play. So, for example, like Sue Ellen Roca, this is a piece called Big Policeman Eek from 1977 from our collection that was in one of the original Harry Who shows. And I just, again, with the Harry Who and the imagist, women just shine. We have Roca, Nilsson, Ramberg, Rossi, I call them the four writers, the apocalyptist, which is a word I just made up. And like their male cohorts and their husbands, these women forged distinctive voices for themselves. And they're still singing out today. Christina Ramberg is no longer with us, but her work is traveling around Europe right now on a traveling exhibition about her work and the influence of the constricted, constrained body. Gladys Nilsson just recently had a New York Times article about her recent exhibition. Pretty wonderful article. Barbara Rossi has had an exhibition at the DePaul Art Museum in the last couple of years, and Sue Ellen Rocha is going to have a show at the Vienna Secession coming up this year. They're still going strong, so shout out to them. Two pieces that are already in the exhibition from this Imagist group is, of course, Carl Worson, who is still with us, though not doing so well, and his figure is sort of distinctly Imagist. He created these creatures that are part human, part animal, part machine, which I think is a real important part of his work. And his image really did resonate out into pop culture. He did record covers, magazine covers, he did illustrations for Playboy, and this particular piece, this print, was done when it coincides with a commission that he did for Playboy magazine. This piece was called The First Portrait of a Brand New Star from 1970. And it's his take on a sort of adrenaline-soaked centerfold making her debut. There is a really raw sort of sensuality to his work. And Paschke, this piece that's in the exhibition out here in the lobby, is called Green Ava. And Paschke liked these, he was part of this second wave, favored these bright, lurid neon colors and these exaggerated figurative style that borrowed from television media, burlesque theater, he really loved burlesque theater, and tattoo culture. His figures, both portraits and invented persona, were often blurred towards abstraction, like this piece, with intense patterning and extravagant play of proportion. So Green Ava is one of these inventions of his. It's a psychedelic avatar of the television generation, whose sunglasses reflect back like a blank screen. And then to wrap up here, we've got, I just wanted to hit a few other pieces real quick in the last remaining minutes. Then we get to your questions, because I'm sure you have questions. So if you saw this piece, Hector Duarte. So this isn't really sort of stepping out of sort of timeline and just looking at thematic ideas within the exhibition, what the figure can do, how it can tell the story, how it can tell the politicized body. Of course, with the advent of postmodernism and feminism, we think about the body as a political vehicle. And Hector Duarte came to Mexico as a student from Mexico to Chicago in 1978. And he was primarily a muralist. And he worked primarily at Pilsen in the Mexican community. He's very closely tied and intimately tied with that community and felt that work should be visible and accessible to everyone as a sort of marker, as a celebration of Mexican heritage in Chicago. But this particular print from 2007, it's got a really sort of very strong critique. It's translated roughly as they see you, they treat you. And in his idea of migrants, at the border being seen as a fingerprint and as a barcode, where the sort of true identity is lost behind the statistic. He did many works like that. This painting, actually jumping back to 1956, by Marion Hall, not a known artist at all. She actually finished at the Art Institute. She went to work at the Field Museum as an illustrator for many, many years. But here's a self-portrait from 1956, and it's kind of remarkable because she's, for its attitude and clothing. So what I wrote was, Hall presents herself dressed in men's attire and holding herself with a slouchy nonchalance of a working class tough. And she was. Hall personifies the 1950s butch. This is a Ouija photograph taken in a lesbian bar. And she was showing herself as an emerging persona among lesbians of her time. Tough, determined, and openly presenting in public in male attire, despite the retrenched attitudes of 1950s Cold War morality. It's kind of an extraordinary portrait of a particular time and place. Elzier Corder, painter and printmaker who was based here in Chicago, came from Richmond, Virginia, as a child, was raised in Chicago, was involved with the Southside Community Art Center and with the WPA, and was given a Julius Rosenwald fellowship to travel to the Sea Isles, to live among and to photograph or to draw and explore the Gala culture, the African island culture of Georgia and South Carolina. And that time there really sealed for him what he considered, what he called, he kept going back and back to that culture and to those people that he met, and particularly the women. And in many ways, there is a sort of sensuality, a sexualizing of a figure who painted basically nude women over and over and over again, so obviously it was a predilection. But he also said that the black woman represents the black race. For him, this Gullah, these last remaining Gullah communities in the Sea Isles were this hold to history for him. It was an anchor to something that he felt as a sort of burgeoning civil rights movement, was burgeoning black culture, consciousness in Chicago, with the Harlem and Chicago Renaissances, was something that we needed to, that he needed to understand, we needed to understand. And that's a figure that he returned to again and again. Followed by Marvin Lee Pitchford Jolly, who was an artist who came from Mississippi as a young woman and was a social worker in town on the South Side. And her memories and recollections of like playing in the mud stayed with her. She made this series of ceramic sculptures based what she called mud people. And this is Spirit Woman number 2, and she called her studio Mud People. In her interview from 2010, Jolly spoke about her draw to clay as a connection with her family and childhood. Quote, as a girl, I enjoyed sinking my fingers in the mud and making pies in different shapes and sizes. Part of that little girl is in me. Spirit Woman, too, honors her childhood memories of women in the family, as well as honoring the place of women as guide and ancestors. And Jolly was part of that South Side movement of burgeoning of African-American artists. Riva Lara, another artist dealing very strongly with identity, is an artist and a disability rights activist and writer. And one of the things that she deals with in her work is the issue of physical identity and socially challenged body. And also her portrait, she focuses on representations of people with impairments, but those whose sexuality or gender identity have also been stigmatized. So across her whole body of work is this relationship to a broader community of disability, of gender, of sexuality. And in this self-portrait called If Body Dress, it's her with her mother's wedding dress, with her own physical presence, knowing and not being able to step into that model, that role of her mother and the women before her, and forging really kind of this really strong, wonderful sense of identity for herself. This is Teki Lomaniki, a Chicago playwright. This is an example of the sort of work she does, celebrating disability, different ability culture. And there is, and here is Riva herself with another self-portrait. And then last, Marion Perkins. Who had very little formal training, came as a young child, part of the Great Migration at age 8 from, he came from Arkansas, and that was in 1916. He had a newsstand on the South Side, not much training, but we would go and scavenge stones from demolished buildings, sills and window ledges and door jambs, and use those to carve his figures. It was oftentimes when they had this very narrow profile because he was working with what he had. They would carve them on the sidewalk outside of his newsstand, and got the attention of people within the Chicago community, including people involved with the Illinois Art Project for the WPA. Ended up like becoming a very important voice in the African American community in Chicago and also nationwide. His work has a very, here's Marion with one of his pieces. And his work has that very sort of solid, heroic form that we kind of associate with the social realism of the WPA. He studied with Cy Gordon, who very definitely worked with that style and definitely had an influence on him. But he brings his own experience as an African American to his work, carving his figures with a stoic dignity in the face of oppression, segregation, economic hardship. These are all the things that he would write about and speak about. And the sculpture that's out there is called Skywatcher. And it's from a series of work that was a commentary on the Cold War politics, and especially the threat of atomic war. After the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he wrote about that in relationship to saying they only dropped bombs on the Asians, they weren't dropping bombs on Europe. Like, he felt there was inherent racism in that. And he equated that with his own struggle as a black man, and saw this always looking over your shoulder at what's coming at you from above as the impetus for this project of the Sky Watchers. And that is what's behind this piece. And I'm going to end it there because we are at time. There's a couple more things I could talk about, but I think that's a good place to end. So, which just goes to show you there's so much to talk about. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to do this with you. Thank you for sticking it out. Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions or comments? We don't have to. Yes.
I came across a quote a couple of years ago from French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who said that we were going from a period of individuals to what he called divisions. An individual is somebody who is a sentient being who can't be divided, whereas a dividual is somebody who basically is made of information and can be plundered by, Google or whatever.
Right.
So I wonder, given all that, I'm trying to imagine what this show might look like 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. And I saw the Monster Roster show, and it was very, it woke me up in that they were kind of dealing with the same thing. Maybe it was the fear of communism or whatever, but external things that were invading the individual and the psychological issues going on at the time, as far as, consumerism and all that stuff. So, there's a question in there somewhere, but in light of that, and the assault of social media, it's an unprecedented assault, and the individual is analyzed and devoured by the internet. And I just wonder, what's that going to do to making art, and how are people going to orient themselves when they go to work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's a big question. And I think in some ways, a show like this 10 years from now is going to feel very remote. Part of it is much of this work was made in an analog period as well too, when it's really human contact. It's reading a book and reading, in 1910, you're looking at a black and white image of a Billy Duchamp in a newspaper, and you're soaking that in. It's a different seepage of experience into these artists' lives, perhaps, and then it's sort of moving out to influence each other, and I think it's based on social interaction that's probably more direct, and in many cases probably fairly isolating as well too. We can say that the same today, that we get all this information readily at our fingertips, but are we any more connected with each other or not? That's the big, it seems to be the debate that I understand as well too. But in terms of production, for anyone who teaches now as well too, or involved with education, with art education, there's a whole different language of practitioner and social engagement and other words that really have removed from much of the practice that many of these artists that are in this exhibition. This has become probably a bit historic. But then again, maybe 10 years, there might be a swing back to it. Artists may throw away their phones and computers and go back to something else. May revive some of this particular thinking. I don't know. But that's practice. I still think that some artists now, whether they're working digitally, working, with whatever particular medium, are addressing the same idea of subjectivity. And certainly now artists, I'm a collage artist, and I look at the explosion of collage and its relationship to the body. This whole idea, to me that feels so monster roster when I'm looking at some of these artists who are just exploding the body, looking at it as this thing that is dividual, divisive, dividable, broken apart in chunks. It's an existential argument as well too about who we are as a whole person and how we are pulled perhaps in different directions, or how we're mediated in a way not to feel whole, or to mediate it in a way to be just to take on more than we could actually carry. I want to take it back to metaphors like, what can you handle? What can you carry? What does the body actually can contain? One of the last pieces I'm going to talk about is that broken open, that really big piece. It's just the simplest outline of the figure. It's based on this the Talmud, or about the Kabbalah, about the sort of story about all the sort of wisdom of the world pre-creation put into these vessels that are too weak to carry all that strength, and they fall apart, and everything is sort of lost, and that we, through our deeds and through our actions, try to pull those pieces of the vessel back together. But as one sort of biblical scholar said, in the process of trying to reconnect those vessels back together, we blow ourselves apart, because we challenge everything that we believe in, that we know about ourselves, as we try to repair the world outside of us. So that is the weird cycle of all this. We can talk about it all night. Great. Other questions or comments? Yes.
You mentioned an artist that I was just curious if you could spell for me. His name is Seymour Soft.
Seymour Rossi.
Rossi.
R-O-S-O-F-S-K-Y. Seymour. He was a monster roster, and later, really great work.
That piece you showed, do you remember the title?
That one is called, it's called like, look, it's like, no I don't. Do Google search. Google search Seymour Rossi will come up because it's one of his important pieces. And he and Jude Leaf early on in their career had this great love affair going on, and their work really paralleled each other. She really spurred him in that work. It was something like unemployment office, because it's all those people in chairs lined up. Yeah, and she did similar work as well too. This idea of these kind of like mirrored, endless infinity spaces with like these lone figures.
Yeah,
and it was really an existential crisis, Yeah, exactly. Tucker is a great person. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
Can you speak about the title figurism and also how maybe it's changed or how you feel about it over time?
It's a made-up word. I love making up words. But figurism, because it's like movement, surrealism is a movement called figurism. I think the figure is really the thing that kind of threads through this history. And because you did the logo for this, right, for that exhibition. Gene is our designer for much of that. And it's also a play off of ISM, Illinois State Museum figure. And when I think about it, is I'm still I find myself going back to the collection over and over again to look at narrative, figure. I've got a show at the Lockport Gallery, which is about history and allegory and narrative art. It's all from our collection. There's a lot of figure in that as well too. I think it's just for me, it's just like it's like candy. I just want to go back to again and again and again. Maybe not candy, but something a little more sustainable. Soup. Yes. Anything else? Yes.
So this collection that's on here, your curated collection that you've prepared for us, what does that represent as a percentage of what you had to choose from? Because one thing that I noticed about this show, and it might be because it's been curated that way, is that it lacks a certain amount of narcissism that I see now in figurative work.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that was your curatorial editing, that why it refreshingly lacks that narcissism that I see so much today present in figurative work.
I don't think, we don't have that's one of the things, our collection it's growing, we're getting work. I can't think of anything specifically that we have that really might be narcissistic.
That you edited out, but yeah. So, I mean, is this like 10%
well, that's great.
of the Illinois collection?
Yeah, we have 4,000 pieces in
wow.
our collection.
Oh,
And that's what's cataloged. that sometimes one of those entries is actually like 30 pieces. So we have quite a bit to choose from, and it goes back to the mid-19th century. I left out late 19th century because it was just shifting a little bit. It was really, that's a whole other exhibition. And just part of it is space. I wanted to have pretty equal men and women. try to have a broad time frame, and works that sort of spoke to each other as well too. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Well, thanks so much.